I signed the death note the same way I had hundreds of times before, with a steady hand and a tired wrist, and that ordinary motion is the part that still unsettles me. It was just another winter night at Cedar Haven Inpatient Hospice, the kind of place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Hospice is not an emergency room. We don't chase miracles. We manage comfort symptoms, families, and paperwork, usually in that order. I was 47 years old at the time, old enough to trust my instincts and experienced enough to know when not to dramatize things. I had worked alongside hospital doctors and nurses for decades before moving into hospice medicine. I understood the rhythm of night shifts, the quiet hallways, the dimmed lights, and the way time stretches when most of the building is asleep. Cedar Haven sat just outside Madison, connected loosely to a larger hospital system, but it felt like its own world after midnight. That night began exactly the way hundreds of others had. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and reheated coffee. The nurse's station was half-lit monitors silent because comfort care patients aren't tethered to machines. Charts were stacked neatly, medications logged, doors cracked open so families could be nearby without feeling watched. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested that this shift would follow me home for years. The patient who arrived earlier that evening was named Kara Wynn. She was 29, transferred from the hospital after a serious car accident. The emergency department had done everything it could. By the time she reached us, the focus had shifted. Comfort care only. Do not resuscitate. The paperwork was clean signed, reviewed, and double-checked. Her chart listed multiple sedating medications, pain control, and notes about hypothermia from prolonged exposure at the scene. I read through her file the way I always did. Not rushing, not lingering. Trauma cases sometimes come with emotional weight, but hospice medicine trains you to stay grounded. You treat the patient in front of you, not the what-ifs. Kara's family had been through days of uncertainty already. By the time they agreed to hospice, they wanted peace more than answers. Around 1 a.m, her breathing changed. It slowed, became shallow, then irregular. A nurse called me quietly, the way you do when you already know the outcome, but need the physician present. I stepped into the room, listened, observed, and waited. The room was dim curtains drawn, family seated close but silent. After several minutes, there was nothing. No breath, no detectable pulse at the wrist. I followed protocol. I listened longer than most people think is necessary because hospice teaches patience. No heart sounds, no respiratory effort. I noted the time, checked again, then spoke softly to the family. I pronounced Kara Wynn deceased at 1:18 a.m. It felt routine, almost too routine, and that should have bothered me more than it did. The family was given privacy. The nurse documented. I completed the initial death note in the chart, the same template I had used countless times. In hospice, death rarely feels dramatic. It feels administrative. That is not a criticism. It is how the system is designed to protect everyone involved. About 40 minutes later, I was back at the nurse's station finishing another note when Ethan, one of our overnight aides, hesitated near the desk. He was young, observant, and not prone to exaggeration. He didn't interrupt right away. He waited until I looked up. He said, "Can you come look at something with me?" There was nothing urgent in his voice, which is why I followed him without thinking much about it. Back in Kara's room, the family had stepped out briefly. The lights were low. Ethan pointed not dramatically, just enough to draw my attention. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed a subtle movement at her chest that could have been settling or could have been something else. I checked her neck again. This time, after a few seconds, I felt something faint. Not a strong pulse, not even a normal one, but a suggestion of rhythm. Slow, weak. The kind of finding that makes you question your own fingers before you question reality. I didn't say anything right away. I checked again. Same result. My mind moved through possibilities quickly. Hypothermia, medications, artifacts, my own fatigue. Hospice medicine teaches you to be cautious, not reactive. Still, the room felt different. This is the moment where I want to pause and say something directly to you. If you've ever worked in a hospital or hospice, or if you've ever sat with a loved one at the end of life, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me what brought you to this video, and if stories from doctors and nurses help you understand these moments differently. And if you want more real hospital and hospice stories told honestly, consider subscribing to the channel. These conversations matter more than we admit. I asked the nurse to join me. She felt it too. We didn't panic. We didn't announce anything. We stood there quiet, aware that something about this case was not lining up with how the night was supposed to go. Kara's body was cool, but not as cold as I would have expected. Her medications could explain some things, but not everything. I stepped back and looked at the chart again. DNR, comfort care. No monitors, no interventions planned. The hospital had signed off. We were now in that narrow space. Hospice rarely talks about where doing nothing can feel heavier than doing something. At that point, my phone buzzed with a message from the charge nurse asking if everything was settled. I typed back a short response, intentionally vague, buying myself a few minutes to think. In medicine, uncertainty is usually loud. This one was quiet, and that made it harder. I stood at the doorway of the room, listening to the building settle around us, the soft hum of heating vents, the distant sound of a cart rolling down the hall. Nothing else in Cedar Haven had changed. Every other patient was exactly where they had been an hour earlier. The system was moving forward, unaware that my certainty had just taken its first crack. I stayed in the doorway longer than I meant to, my hand still resting on the frame, feeling the faint vibration of the building's heating system through my palm. It was a small grounding sensation, the kind you notice only when you are trying very hard not to overthink. I stepped back into the room and closed the door halfway, not to hide anything but to narrow the moment down to just the people who needed to be there. The nurse looked at me without speaking. That's something you learn working night shifts together. Words are often the least efficient tool. I checked Kara again, this time slower, more deliberate. Her chest barely moved, if at all. The pulse at her neck was still faint, inconsistent enough that I couldn't have sworn to it in a courtroom, but present enough that I couldn't ignore it either. I felt an unexpected flash of irritation at myself. This was hospice. I knew exactly what hospice was for. I had explained it to families more times than I could count. Comfort over cure, no aggressive intervention, allow natural death. Those principles don't disappear just because something feels uncomfortable. I asked the nurse what time she had last documented vital signs. She told me, and it matched what I remembered. Everything had been done correctly. There was no missing step, no obvious mistake. That was part of the problem. I stepped to the side of the bed and checked Kara's temperature with a temporal scanner. Low, but not alarmingly so given her chart and the room conditions. Hypothermia had been mentioned in the hospital notes. Prolonged exposure at the scene combined with sedating medications could blur a lot of lines. I told myself that twice slowly, as if repetition might turn uncertainty into fact. Ethan stood near the foot of the bed, hands clasped in front of him, trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching my face. I caught his eye and gave a small nod, the unspoken message being that he had done the right thing by saying something. Whatever this turned out to be, silence would have been worse. I asked the nurse to pull up the chart again. We reviewed it together, not because we expected new information to appear, but because reviewing something familiar can steady you. DNR was clear. Comfort care orders were clear. No instructions for escalation, no ambiguity that could be solved with a checkbox. I considered calling the hospitalist on record, then hesitated. This was no longer a hospital case in the traditional sense. Kara had been transferred out precisely because further intervention was not aligned with her goals of care. Calling someone just to share my unease felt both necessary and strangely inappropriate. Instead, I called the charge nurse first. I described what we were seeing in careful clinical language, deliberately avoiding words that carried emotional weight. Faint pulse, possible residual activity, no clear respiratory effort. The response on the other end of the line was calm but cautious. She reminded me correctly that post-mortem changes are not always immediate, especially in cases involving hypothermia and medications. She wasn't wrong. That's what made the conversation unsatisfying. I hung up and leaned against the counter near the sink, listening to the soft drip of a faucet that hadn't been fully closed. In medical training, you're taught to trust protocols because they represent collective experience. Thousands of cases distilled into guidelines. Deviating from them without cause is dangerous. Deviating from them because something feels off is even worse. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I walked back to the bedside and checked Kara's pupils. Fixed, dilated, no response to light. That should have been reassuring. I checked again anyway. Same result. I noted it silently, filing it away as evidence that this was likely nothing more than physiology playing tricks in an unusual context. The nurse asked me quietly whether we should stop post-mortem care for the moment. It was a reasonable question. We had already begun the earliest steps, the ones that are more about dignity than process. Straightening linens, adjusting the bed, nothing invasive. Still, the idea of continuing while my own assessment felt incomplete made my stomach tighten. I told her to pause. Just pause. No one argued. In hospice, pausing is often the most humane option available. Minutes passed without anything changing. The room remained still. Kara's face was slack, peaceful in the way it often is after death, not tense or distressed. If someone had walked in without context, they would have seen exactly what they expected to see. I checked my watch. Time in these moments doesn't move the way it does on busy hospital floors. Each minute felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself had thickened. I considered calling the county medical examiner, then dismissed the thought, then brought it back again. Technically, there was no requirement to notify them of anything unusual at this stage. Kara had been pronounced, and there were no signs of trauma inconsistent with her history. Calling would mean documenting uncertainty that I could not yet define. That hesitation surprised me. I had always believed transparency was the safest path. Now I was confronted with the possibility that transparency might create more problems than it solved without actually helping the patient. Ethan shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The nurse adjusted her stance. No one spoke. The building around us remained oblivious, heaters cycling on and off, doors down the hall opening and closing softly as other staff went about their work. I realized then that my discomfort wasn't about whether Kara was alive or dead in some absolute sense. It was about the gap between what the system expected me to do and what my instincts were telling me to slow down. Medicine doesn't like gaps. Hospice tolerates them, but only up to a point. I took a breath and made a decision that felt both minor and significant. I told the nurse to document everything exactly as observed, without interpretation, times, findings, no conclusions, facts only. It was a small assertion of control, a way to anchor myself to something solid. As she stepped away to chart, I remained by the bed listening to the room. I wasn't waiting for a miracle or a reversal. I was waiting for clarity, whatever form it took. In my years as a doctor, I had learned that clarity doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it seeps in quietly through persistence rather than urgency. I placed my fingers lightly against Kara's neck one more time, not searching now, just observing. The faint rhythm I had noticed earlier seemed unchanged, neither stronger nor weaker. That somehow unsettled me more than if it had disappeared entirely. I straightened, aware of the weight of the moment pressing against a framework of policies that suddenly felt less solid than they had an hour earlier. Without announcing it to anyone, I understood that whatever happened next would test not just my medical judgment, but my comfort with the limits of what hospice care is designed to hold. I didn't pull my hand back right away, partly because I didn't want to draw attention to what I was doing, and partly because I needed to be sure my own senses weren't betraying me. Feeling for a pulse is usually a reflex, something you do without thinking, but now every second my fingers stayed in place, felt deliberate. The rhythm under my fingertips wasn't strong, but it was consistent enough that it stopped being easy to dismiss. I straightened and took a step back, giving myself physical distance before mental distance. That's a trick you learn early in medicine. When something doesn't make sense, change your position. Sometimes a different angle fixes the problem. Sometimes it confirms that the problem is real. The nurse returned with the chart tablet in her hands, already typing. I watched her for a moment, the calm efficiency of her movements grounding me more than I expected. Nurses see the same things doctors do, often earlier, and they are less protected by layers of abstraction. When a nurse looks uneasy, it's worth paying attention. I asked her what she was seeing. She chose her words carefully, which told me she was doing the same internal calculus I was. She said the same thing she had said before, that Kara didn't look the way deceased patients usually look after this amount of time, but that she couldn't point to a single concrete reason why. It was a description built on absence rather than presence. I nodded and asked Ethan to step out for a moment, not because he had done anything wrong, but because this was no longer a situation where extra bodies helped. Once he left, the room felt smaller, quieter, more focused. I checked Kara again, this time using a Doppler we kept locked in the med room for rare situations. Hospice doesn't use it often, but it's there for a reason. The sound that came through the speaker was faint and slow but unmistakably vascular. It wasn't artifact. It wasn't my imagination. It was blood moving through a vessel. I turned the volume down immediately. Loud confirmation felt inappropriate, almost invasive. The nurse heard it anyway. We didn't look at each other. There was no need. The meaning was clear. My first reaction was not fear. It was irritation, sharp and unexpected, directed not at the patient, but at the situation. I had done everything right. The hospital had done everything right. The paperwork was flawless. And yet here we were in a space the system did not account for. I documented the finding myself choosing neutral language. Faint Doppler detectable pulse at carotid artery, no audible heart sounds on auscultation, no spontaneous respirations observed, pupils fixed and non-reactive. I stopped there. Interpretation could wait. I considered calling the family back into the room, then stopped myself. Bringing them in without clarity would create a kind of harm that couldn't be undone. Hope is a powerful drug, and in hospice, we are careful about when and how we administer it. Instead, I called the county medical examiner's office, not to report a death, but to ask a question that felt both obvious and absurd. I described the findings without embellishment. The physician on call listened, asked a few clarifying questions, then paused. The pause was longer than I expected. He reminded me that pronouncement of death is a clinical judgment, not a guarantee of immediate cellular shutdown. He mentioned hypothermia medications and the rare phenomenon of delayed circulatory activity. He did not sound alarmed. He sounded tired. I asked him what he would do. He said carefully that in a hospice setting with a valid DNR, there was no indication for resuscitative efforts. He advised continued observation and thorough documentation. His answer was correct, and it left me feeling oddly abandoned. I hung up and rested my phone on the counter, resisting the urge to check the time again. Time wasn't the variable that mattered anymore. Certainty was. The nurse asked if we should notify hospital administration. I thought about it, then shook my head. Escalating to people who were not physically present would shift the focus away from the patient and toward liability. That might protect the institution, but it wouldn't clarify what was happening in this room. I walked back to the bedside and watched Kara's face. There was no sign of distress. If anything, she looked as she had earlier, relaxed in the way deep sedation produces. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made the discrepancy harder to accept. I pressed lightly on her nail bed, testing for any response. Nothing. I shone a penlight into her eyes again, slower this time, waiting longer. Still nothing. Every test that should have settled the matter did exactly what it was supposed to do, and yet the Doppler sound lingered in my mind. I realized then that my discomfort wasn't about the possibility that Kara might be alive in some conventional sense. It was about the realization that death, at least as we define it in medicine, is a process rather than a moment. A process with edges that blur under certain conditions, especially the ones we see in hospice. I asked the nurse to stay with me in the room, not because I needed assistance, but because I needed a witness. Shared observation carries a different weight than solitary judgment. If I was going to stand in this uncertainty, I didn't want to do it alone. We stood quietly for several minutes, watching, listening, noting. Nothing changed. The pulse remained faint. The room remained still. The building continued its nighttime routines without interruption. I felt the urge to resolve the situation, to force it into a category that would allow me to move on to the next task. That urge was strong, and I recognized it as a warning sign. When doctors rush to closure, mistakes follow. I took another breath and made a second decision, one that felt heavier than the first. I instructed the nurse to hold all post-mortem procedures until further notice. No washing, no repositioning, nothing beyond maintaining comfort and dignity as if Kara were still alive. She nodded without question. That response stayed with me. Trust like that is both a gift and a responsibility. As I stood there listening to the quiet, I understood that this case had already crossed an invisible line, not because of what Kara was doing, but because of what I was no longer able to assume. The framework I relied on to make clean decisions had developed a crack, and through it, uncertainty was beginning to seep in, steady and unignorable. I kept my voice low when I told the nurse to notify the charge nurse that we were pausing everything. Not stopping, not reversing, just pausing. That distinction mattered to me more than it probably should have. In hospice, words carry weight because they shape expectations. Pausing meant we were still inside the rules, even if we were leaning against the edges. The charge nurse came down a few minutes later, coat still on, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had been asleep not long before the call came through. She listened while I explained, and she didn't interrupt. That alone told me she understood the seriousness of what I was saying. When I finished, she asked the same question I had already asked myself a dozen times. Was there any indication of discomfort? I told her no. Kara's face remained slack, her body still, her breathing non-existent. The only thing that didn't fit was the circulation we could detect if we tried hard enough. The charge nurse nodded slowly, her expression tightening. She reminded me gently that hospice care is built around honoring patient wishes, not correcting physiology. Kara had a valid DNR. She had been transitioned away from hospital-level intervention by design. If we acted now, we risked violating the very principles that brought her here. I agreed with her in theory, which made disagreeing in practice much harder. I asked her what she would do if it were her license on the line. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked me a different question. Could I say with certainty that Kara was alive in a way that would benefit from intervention? I opened my mouth, then closed it. Certainty was exactly what I did not have. I had anomalies, not answers. The charge nurse suggested we call risk management for guidance. The suggestion landed with a dull weight. Risk management exists to protect institutions from worst-case scenarios, not to help clinicians sit with uncertainty. Still, she was right. Ignoring that channel would create its own problems. I made the call myself, describing the situation in clipped, factual language, careful not to sound either alarmist or dismissive. The response was predictable. The administrator on the line asked about documentation, DNR status, and whether the patient had been officially pronounced. When I said yes, she paused, then advised continued observation without escalation, unless clear signs of life emerged. Clear was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I thanked her and ended the call, feeling no more supported than before. While we spoke, the nurse stayed at Kara's bedside, adjusting a blanket that didn't need adjusting, maintaining the quiet rituals that give hospice its shape. Watching her, I felt a flicker of resentment toward the systems that required us to speak in abstractions while a real person lay between us and the rules. Medicine likes clarity because clarity simplifies responsibility. The charge nurse asked whether the family should be updated. I thought about the mother's face when I had told her Kara had died, the way relief and grief had arrived together. Bringing her back into the room now would reopen something that might not have a meaningful resolution. I decided against it, at least for the moment, and explained why. The charge nurse accepted my reasoning, though I could tell she was uneasy. Time continued to pass without incident. Kara's body remained unchanged, her skin cool but not cold, her posture unaltered. If I had walked in fresh at that moment without knowing the history, I would have seen a deceased patient receiving respectful care. Context is everything in medicine. Strip it away, and reality looks deceptively simple. I found myself thinking about the training I had received when I first entered hospice medicine. We were taught to recognize dying, to distinguish it from reversible decline, and to accept that our role was not to intervene, but to accompany. What we were not taught was how to respond when dying refused to follow the expected script without quite reversing course. The nurse asked if I wanted to sit down. I realized then that I had been standing for a long time. I took a chair and positioned it near the bed, close enough to observe without hovering. Sitting felt like a commitment, an acknowledgement that this moment required patience rather than action. As I watched, I noted small details I might have ignored earlier: the absence of modeling, the lack of jaw stiffness. Things that in isolation mean little, but together added to the sense that Kara's body had not fully transitioned. I documented these observations mentally, resisting the urge to assign them meaning beyond what I could justify. I checked my phone again, not for messages, but out of habit. The world outside Cedar Haven was continuing normally. Somewhere other doctors were making decisions with more data and less ambiguity. I envied them briefly, then dismissed the thought. Every specialty has its version of this moment. This one just happened to be mine. The charge nurse eventually stepped out to update staffing notes, leaving me and the bedside nurse alone again. The room settled back into its earlier quiet, the kind that invites reflection, whether you want it or not. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing inward, not as panic, but as a slow accumulation of questions with no immediate answers. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, and focused on Kara's face. Whatever else was true, she was not suffering. That knowledge anchored me more than any protocol. Hospice is built on that principle, and I held on to it as the one solid thing in a situation that had grown increasingly fluid. Without announcing it aloud, I recognized that the clean boundary I had relied on between life and death had softened, not disappeared, not reversed, just blurred enough to make standing on either side feel less secure. I stayed where I was attentive, aware, and unwilling to force resolution where none yet existed. I was watching the rise and fall of nothing when the nurse's hand tightened around the bed rail. It wasn't dramatic, just a small change in posture, the kind that usually means someone has noticed something they don't yet want to name. I shifted my attention without moving my body, letting my eyes do the work before my thoughts caught up. Kara's fingers twitched once, not the kind of movement you see when a body settles or when a muscle releases after death, but a brief, deliberate flex, like a reflex searching for direction. The nurse and I looked at each other at the same time. No one spoke. Words would have cheapened what we were seeing. I stood and moved closer slowly enough that I didn't disturb the air around the bed. I had learned long ago that sudden motion can change how you interpret a moment. I wanted this one to be as unfiltered as possible. Kara's hand lay palm up against the sheet, relaxed but not slack. I watched it carefully, resisting the urge to reach out. Another movement followed, subtle but unmistakable. Her fingers curled inward, then relaxed again. My first instinct was to check for myoclonus, to fit the motion into a known category, but this didn't have the random quality of a reflex discharge. It had shape. Intention was too strong a word, but awareness wasn't entirely wrong. The nurse whispered my name, not as a question, but as an anchor. I nodded once. I didn't trust my voice yet. I placed 2 fingers lightly against Kara's wrist, not searching now, just maintaining contact. The faint pulse was still there, more regular than before. My heart rate picked up in response, an unprofessional but unavoidable reaction. I reminded myself to breathe. Then Kara's hand closed around mine. It wasn't a strong grip, it wasn't coordinated, but it was unmistakable. Pressure brief and uneven, but real. The kind of sensation that bypasses analysis and goes straight to the part of your brain that handles truth. I felt the nurse's intake of breath beside me, sharp and involuntary. I didn't pull away. I didn't squeeze back. I held my hand still, letting the contact exist without interference. Every guideline I knew dissolved in that moment, replaced by something far more basic. A person was responding to touch. Kara's eyes did not open. Her breathing did not resume. Her body remained otherwise still, but her hand stayed closed around mine for a few seconds longer than I expected, then loosened gradually as if releasing something it had briefly secured. I became acutely aware of the sound in the room, the hum of the vents, the distant clink of a cart down the hallway. None of it mattered. The center of the world had narrowed to a single point of contact that had just ended. The nurse covered her mouth with her free hand, eyes wide, struggling to regulate her breathing. I felt strangely calm, the kind of calm that sometimes comes when a decision has been made for you. There was no longer any ambiguity about whether something was happening. The question now was what that something meant. I stepped back and asked the nurse to call the charge nurse immediately. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. While she made the call, I checked Kara's vital signs again, moving through the motions. Not because I expected different results, but because documenting what was happening mattered more now than ever. As I worked, Kara's eyelids fluttered. Not fully open, just enough to reveal a sliver of sclera, before closing again. It was the smallest possible response, but it landed with the force of a revelation. This was no longer a theoretical discussion about physiology. This was a patient demonstrating awareness in the narrowest window available to her. The charge nurse arrived quickly, followed by another nurse who had been pulled from a different unit. They took in the scene without comment, eyes moving from Kara to me to the chart. I summarized what had happened in precise language, careful not to let interpretation creep in. As if responding to the sound of voices, Kara's hand lifted again. This time, higher fingers curling toward her chest before dropping back onto the sheet. The movement was clumsy and brief, but coordinated enough to silence any remaining doubt in the room. One of the nurses reached for the call button, instinctively then froze. We all knew what that reflex meant in other settings. Hospital training is hard to override even in hospice. I shook my head slightly, not as an order, but as a reminder of where we were and why Kara had been brought here. I felt the tension in the room spike. The charge nurse asked me quietly but urgently what I wanted to do. The question carried more weight than it appeared. It wasn't about a single decision. It was about choosing which framework would govern the next few minutes of care. Before I could answer, Kara made a sound. It wasn't speech. It was more like a breath pushed through a throat that wasn't ready to cooperate. Still, it was unmistakably human. The nurse closest to the bed reached for Kara's shoulder, then stopped herself, glancing at me for confirmation. I nodded. Touch was appropriate. Comfort was appropriate. Panic was not. Kara's lips moved again, shaping something that didn't quite form. The nurse leaned in, and I did too, not because I expected clarity, but because presence felt like the only ethical response left to us. The room was silent except for Kara's effort to make sound. Her eyes opened, briefly unfocused, but present. They did not track or fix on anything, but they were undeniably open. In that moment, the distinction between living and dying collapsed into something too narrow to categorize. The charge nurse exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she had been holding for a long time. I could see the question forming in her mind, the same one pressing against my own. If Kara could respond, even this minimally, what did that obligate us to do? I reached for Kara's hand again, this time with intention. Her fingers closed weakly around mine once more, then relaxed. No escalation followed, no sudden change. Just that small, undeniable confirmation that whatever process was unfolding, it had not yet fully completed. I became aware of how still everyone else had become, as if movement might shatter the fragile coherence of the moment. I felt the weight of every policy, every ethical lecture, every hospice principle pressing inward, not as guidance, but as background noise. Standing there, hands still warm from Kara's grip, I understood that this case had crossed beyond protocols and into something far more personal. The room had gone quiet, not because nothing was happening, but because everyone present recognized that something irreversible had already shifted, and no amount of training could make it simple again. I didn't let go of Kara's hand right away, partly because I was afraid of what it would mean if I did, and partly because it was the only thing in the room that felt concrete. Her grip had faded back into stillness, but the warmth lingered on my skin longer than I expected. I focused on that sensation, using it to keep myself anchored while the rest of the room recalibrated around us. The nurses moved carefully now, not rushed, not frozen either. Someone dimmed the lights a fraction more. Another adjusted the bed so Kara's shoulders were slightly elevated, a comfort measure we would have done hours earlier if this had followed a normal course. No one spoke about calling emergency services. No one reached for equipment that didn't belong in hospice. We all understood without saying it out loud that this was not a return to life in any meaningful sense. Kara's eyes closed again, this time without fluttering. Her face slackened, the brief tension around her mouth dissolving. I checked her pulse once more. It was weaker now, uneven in a way that suggested a system failing rather than reviving. The Doppler confirmed what my fingers already knew. Whatever circulation had been sustaining those moments of response was fading. I signaled to the nurse to document the changes. She nodded and moved quietly to the chart, typing with the efficiency that comes from long familiarity with uncomfortable truths. The charge nurse stood back near the wall, arms crossed, watching not just Kara, but all of us, gauging reactions, anticipating questions that would come later. I leaned close enough to Kara to speak, not because I expected her to hear me clearly, but because it felt wrong not to. I told her who I was, that she was safe, that we were there. I didn't say goodbye. Hospice has taught me that words matter most when they are honest, and I wasn't sure what honesty required in that moment. Her breathing did not resume. Minutes passed without movement. The faint pulse disappeared so gradually that I almost missed the moment it was truly gone. I checked again, then again, extending the observation far beyond what protocol demanded. This time there was no ambiguity, no rhythm, no Doppler signal, no residual warmth at the wrist. I listened to her chest, my stethoscope cool against her skin. Silence. The kind of silence that feels final in a way the earlier quiet had not. I waited, counting slowly, then checked once more. The result was the same. The body I was examining now matched the expectations I had been trained to trust. The nurse looked at me, her expression asking a question she didn't voice. I nodded. The change in the room was immediate but subtle. Tension eased, not into relief, but into resignation. This was the ending we knew how to handle. I noted the time carefully and documented the second pronouncement, choosing my language with precision. I did not erase the earlier declaration. Both moments would remain in the record, uncomfortable and unresolved. Medicine rarely gives you the luxury of rewriting history. The charge nurse asked if we should notify the family. I said yes. They deserved to know that Kara's condition had changed again, that the vigil they thought was over had quietly resumed without them. When the nurse stepped out to make the call, I stayed behind, straightening the sheets and smoothing Kara's hair with deliberate care. As I worked, I felt the delayed impact of everything that had happened. Not fear exactly, but a heavy awareness of responsibility settling in my chest. The kind that doesn't spike your pulse but sits with you, insistent and unmoving. The family returned a few minutes later, eyes red, movements cautious, as if they were unsure whether the room they were entering was the same one they had left. I explained what had occurred in simple terms, avoiding jargon, avoiding speculation. I told them Kara had shown brief signs of responsiveness and that we had remained with her. I did not frame it as a mistake or a miracle, just as something that happened. The mother listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When I finished, she nodded once and stepped to the bedside, taking Kara's hand where mine had been. She didn't ask why or how. She didn't ask what it meant. She just stood there, holding on as if the presence mattered more than the explanation. I gave them space, retreating to the doorway, but not leaving the room entirely. The nurses moved with practiced grace, preparing for post-mortem care again, this time without hesitation. The motions felt different now, grounded in certainty rather than doubt. I stepped out into the hallway, briefly leaning against the wall outside the room. The corridor looked exactly the same as it had earlier: lights, low floors, clean doors closed. That normalcy felt almost insulting after what we had just navigated. I took a few steady breaths, aware that my hands were still slightly unsteady. The charge nurse joined me, her voice quiet. She said we would need to initiate a review given the unusual sequence of events. I agreed. There was no avoiding that now. Documentation would be scrutinized, questions would be asked, not about blame necessarily, but about process. She asked how I was holding up. It was a well-intentioned question, and I appreciated it more than I let on. I told her the truth, or at least a version of it. I said I was fine, that I needed to finish the shift, that I would think more clearly later. When I returned to the nurse's station, the clock read just past 4 in the morning. On paper, the night was nearly over. In my body, it felt like it had only just begun. I completed the remaining documentation with care, rereading each entry before saving it. Precision felt like the only defense I had left. As the building settled back into its pre-dawn quiet, I found myself replaying the sequence again and again. The pronouncement, the pause, the hand closing around mine, the second unmistakable stillness. None of it fit neatly into the categories I relied on to make sense of my work. I closed the chart and sat back, listening to the familiar sounds of the unit waking slowly around me. Somewhere coffee was brewing. A phone rang softly and was answered. Life at Cedar Haven continued as it always did, efficient and orderly. I stayed at the desk, staring at the screen without seeing it, aware that the case was technically resolved, but knowing with a certainty that surprised me that something essential had shifted inside me even as the night moved forward, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. I was still finishing my coffee when the email came through, flagged as high priority, the subject line stripped of emotion by design. It referenced Kara Wynn by medical record number, not by name, and scheduled a Sentinel event review for later that afternoon. The timing felt deliberate, as if giving me just enough hours to replay the night in my head before having to narrate it for people who hadn't been there. I arrived early, not out of eagerness, but because waiting at home felt worse. The conference room was windowless and neutral, the kind of space hospitals favor for conversations that need to feel controlled. A long table, too many chairs, a pitcher of water no one ever drinks from. When I sat down, the chair felt colder than expected. One by one, people filtered in. Risk management, nursing leadership, a representative from administration, the charge nurse from that night. No one looked accusatory, no one looked relieved either. This wasn't a meeting designed to assign blame, it was designed to create a record. I began the way I always do, with facts. timeline, observations, documentation. I described the initial pronouncement, the subsequent findings, the patient responses, and the final outcome. I avoided words like alive or dead, sticking to clinical descriptions instead. It felt safer that way. As I spoke, I noticed how quickly the story lost its weight once it was translated into policy language. Delayed postmortem signs, possible residual neurological activity, no deviation from DNR orders. Each phrase softened the edges, making the night sound more manageable than it had felt in real time. Someone asked whether I would do anything differently. It was a fair question, but it landed heavily. I took a moment before answering, aware that this was the kind of response that could follow me for years. I said I would still pause, I would still observe, I would still prioritize comfort over intervention. I did not say that I would want more clarity, because clarity is not always available on demand. Another person asked whether the family had expressed concerns. I said no, which was true. They had not complained. They had not demanded explanations. In some ways, that made this harder. There was no external pressure forcing us to examine what had happened. The discomfort was entirely internal. The meeting moved on to recommendations, better documentation templates, staff education on rare postmortem phenomena, clearer language around pronouncement in hospice settings. All reasonable, all insufficient. None of it addressed the central unease that had followed me since that night. When the meeting ended, I felt the strange anticlimax that often follows institutional processes. The event had been reviewed. The box had been checked. On paper, the system had absorbed the anomaly without cracking. I gathered my notes and stood unsure what emotion I was supposed to feel now. The charge nurse caught up with me in the hallway. She asked how I was doing, the question sounding more genuine than it had during the night. I told her I was fine, which was becoming a habit. She nodded as if she understood what that word really meant in this context. Back on the unit, the pace was familiar. New patients, new families, new charts to review. No one treated me differently. That too felt unsettling. Part of me expected some sign that what had happened mattered more than it apparently did. Later that evening, during another night shift, I found myself paying closer attention than usual. I checked pulses longer. I observed breathing patterns more carefully. I noticed details I might have dismissed before. None of the patients that night presented anything unusual, but my threshold for certainty had changed. A nurse commented that I seemed quieter than usual. I shrugged it off, blaming the meeting. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was harder to articulate. The confidence I had built over decades hadn't vanished, but it had been dented in a way that felt permanent. Over the next few days, I received follow-up emails summarizing the review's conclusions. No deviation from standard of care, no corrective action required, case closed. The phrasing was final decisive. I read each message carefully, looking for something I could argue with. There was nothing to challenge. I tried to return to my normal routines, morning rounds, family meetings, documentation, but small moments kept pulling me back. A patient's hand twitching during care, a breath that paused a fraction longer than expected. Each time my body reacted before my rational mind could intervene. I began to notice how often we rely on patterns to make decisions. Patterns are efficient. They allow us to function in environments where the stakes are high and the variables endless. But patterns also fail in edge cases, and hospice seems to attract edges by its very nature. One night, while reviewing charts, I found myself rereading Kara's record, not for new information, but to see if the story looked different on paper. It didn't. The documentation was thorough, clean, defensible. The record told a version of events that fit neatly within acceptable boundaries. The problem was that I had lived another version alongside it. I closed the chart and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The unit was quiet staff moving softly between rooms. I wondered how many similar cases had passed through other hospices without being noticed, without triggering discomfort strong enough to linger. Not because anyone was careless, but because noticing carries a cost. I didn't talk about Kara much after that. Not because I was instructed not to, but because conversations about it tended to end too quickly. People nodded, offered reasonable explanations, and moved on. I found myself doing the same even as the unease followed me home. The hardest part was realizing that the system had worked exactly as designed. There was no villain, no failure dramatic enough to fix, just a gap between process and experience that no committee could close. I continued to show up for my shifts to make decisions to guide families through difficult hours. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, I was carrying a quiet awareness that certainty in medicine is often borrowed, not owned. As I walked the halls of Cedar Haven that night past rooms filled with people at various stages of letting go, I felt the weight of that awareness settle deeper. Not as panic, not as doubt, but as a persistent question that no meeting agenda had addressed and that no policy language had been able to resolve. I didn't mark the next case as unusual at first. If I had, I might have dismissed it too easily the way clinicians do when they're trying not to overreact. It came in quietly, another transfer from the hospital, another comfort care admission with a clean DNR and a family already exhausted by decisions they never wanted to make. Different patient, different diagnosis, different room. On paper, nothing connected it to Cara Wynne. What connected them was how my body reacted before my mind did. The patient was older this time. Late 60s, advanced neurological disease, minimal responsiveness on arrival. During rounds, everything appeared consistent with expectations. Breathing shallow but regular, skin cool, no signs of distress. The kind of case hospice is designed to handle well. I moved through the assessment smoothly, nodding along as the nurse reported overnight changes. Later that night, when the nurse called to tell me the patient had stopped breathing, I felt my shoulders tense before she finished the sentence. I went to the room immediately aware of how fast my steps sounded in the quiet hallway. The pronouncement itself was straightforward. No detectable pulse, no respirations, fixed pupils. This time I took even longer than usual, counting silently, listening past the point of redundancy. Everything aligned. I pronounced death documented carefully and stepped back. 10 minutes later, the nurse returned her expression neutral but alert. She said she thought she saw movement. The words landed differently now. Not as an anomaly, but as a test. We went back in together. The patient lay still, exactly as expected. No movement, no pulse, no signs of circulation. I waited, watching, resisting the urge to find something simply because I was primed to expect it. After several minutes, nothing happened. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that this case would follow a predictable course. Disappointment that my heightened vigilance had no clear target. The nurse apologized for bothering me. I told her she had done the right thing. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, a different patient, this one with advanced heart failure, was pronounced during the early morning hours. Again, everything appeared textbook. Again, I observed longer than required. Again, I documented with obsessive precision. This time, nearly an hour passed before anything seemed off. I was at the nurse's station when a CNA approached me hesitantly. She said the patient's hand had moved when she adjusted the sheet. She wasn't sure if it was a reflex or something else. She looked embarrassed, even asking. I followed her back. Heart rate steady, but attention sharpened. The room was quiet, the patient unmoving. I waited. Nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to speak, the patient's fingers flexed once subtle and brief. I felt the now familiar tightening in my chest. We observed, we documented, we paused care. No eye-opening, no vocalization, no response to touch. The pulse, if present at all, was too faint to confirm. After several minutes, the movement did not repeat. Eventually, the body cooled in the expected way, rigor developing on schedule. The moment passed without escalation. Later alone, I reviewed the chart. Hypothermia, cardiac medications, prolonged decline, reasonable explanations for delayed post-mortem changes. Nothing indefensible, nothing extraordinary. What unsettled me was the pattern forming in my own perception. Each case taken individually fell within the wide margins of medicine. Together, they created a narrative I didn't know how to interrogate without sounding unprofessional. I started asking nurses more questions during rounds, not leading questions, but open ones. What did you notice overnight? Did anything feel off? The answers were usually mundane, but occasionally someone would pause, searching for language. Those pauses began to stand out to me more than the words themselves. One nurse mentioned that a patient's breathing had resumed briefly after being thought gone. Another recalled a pulse that felt present one moment and absent the next. These stories were offered casually, not as complaints, not as revelations. They were framed as oddities, the kind you file away and move past. I realized then how much of hospice medicine relies on collective agreement to move forward. If no one names the discomfort, it remains manageable. If someone does it, risks becoming something else entirely. My sleep began to suffer, not dramatically at first, just a few hours shaved off each night, my mind replaying moments I would have once forgotten. I found myself lying awake, cataloging signs, replaying the sensation of Kara's hand closing around mine, comparing it to movements I had seen since. During shifts, I caught myself checking pulses longer than necessary, sometimes twice. I listened for breaths that weren't there. I reminded myself repeatedly that vigilance has a cost and that overinterpretation can be as harmful as inattention. Knowing that didn't make it easier to stop. I discussed my concerns cautiously with a colleague, framing them as questions rather than conclusions. She listened, nodded, and offered reasonable explanations. She reminded me of the variability in dying processes, especially in hospice populations. She wasn't dismissive, she was pragmatic. Her response made sense and it didn't relieve me. The difference I realized was that she hadn't been in the room with Kara. She hadn't felt what I had felt. Experience shapes thresholds in ways no guideline can fully address. Over time, I noticed my relationship to the work shifting, not in obvious ways. I still met with families. I still explained comfort measures. I still guided people through decisions with clarity and compassion, but underneath a subtle wariness had taken root. I began to dread pronouncements in a way I never had before, not because I feared death, but because I no longer trusted the moment we labeled it. The act of declaring something finished now felt heavier, more provisional, even when all evidence supported it. I wondered how many clinicians carry similar doubts and simply learn to compartmentalize them. How many moments are absorbed into the background noise of a busy system, their significance dulled by repetition. As these cases accumulated, none dramatic enough to trigger formal review, I felt my confidence eroding in small, steady increments. Not collapsing, just thinning, like fabric worn down at the seams. Walking through the unit one night, I paused outside a patient's room, listening to the sound of breathing through the door. It was slow, irregular, familiar. I stood there longer than necessary, aware that my hesitation was becoming noticeable even to me. I moved on, eventually completing the round, signing notes, answering questions. The work continued, and so did I. But somewhere between those rooms and the nurse's station, it became clear that Kara's case had not been an outlier in the way I wanted it to be. It hadn't repeated exactly. It didn't need to. What it had done was change the way I saw everything that came after, and that shift was now impossible to ignore. I started noticing the physical signs before I admitted anything was wrong. My hands would tremble slightly when the pager went off at night, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough that I felt it when I reached for my phone. I told myself it was caffeine or poor sleep or the kind of low-level stress that comes with working in hospice long enough. All of those explanations were convenient and none of them were complete. The nights became harder, not because patients were more complex, but because my mind refused to stay quiet. I would lie awake, replaying pronouncements, counting seconds, wondering whether I had listened long enough, watched carefully enough, waited sufficiently. I reminded myself that doubt is part of conscientious practice. Then I wondered when conscientiousness had crossed into something else. During one shift, I caught myself standing in a doorway long after I had finished an assessment, listening to a patient breathe, not for clinical reasons, but because leaving felt like making a decision I wasn't ready to own. The nurse glanced at me, puzzled. I stepped away, quickly, embarrassed by how visible my hesitation had become. I requested a meeting with my supervisor, framing it as a routine check-in. We sat in Brizette in her office, the same neutral furniture, the same polite professionalism that defines these conversations. I spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't trigger alarm. I said I was feeling stretched, that the inpatient hospice work was weighing on me more than expected, that I wondered whether a different role might be a better fit. She listened attentively, nodding at the appropriate moments. When I finished, she asked whether anything specific had prompted this. I hesitated, then shook my head. I wasn't ready to explain Kara or the cases that followed, or the way certainty had slipped out from under me. I said it was cumulative, which was true. She suggested reducing my night shifts temporarily. I appreciated the offer, but I knew it wouldn't solve the problem. The issue wasn't fatigue. It was the moment of pronouncement itself, the weight of deciding when something was over. I tried the adjustment anyway. Fewer nights, more daytime coverage. On paper, it helped. In practice, the anxiety followed me. Daytime pronouncements were no easier. If anything, the presence of families made the stakes feel higher. One afternoon, after pronouncing a patient who had died quietly, with family present, I felt a sudden wave of dizziness. Not dramatic, but enough that I had to sit down. A nurse brought me water and asked if I was okay. I smiled and said yes. The lie came easily. I began avoiding certain tasks when I could, letting colleagues take pronouncements if they were available, asking nurses to double-check findings I would have once confirmed alone. These were small shifts, barely noticeable to others, but they mattered to me. They signaled a loss of confidence I had never experienced before. At home, my partner noticed the change before I said anything. She asked why I was quieter, why I seemed distracted, even during simple conversations. I tried to explain without alarming her, but the words came out tangled. How do you describe losing trust in something that once anchored your entire professional identity? One night after a particularly restless evening, I admitted that I was considering stepping away from inpatient hospice. Saying it out loud felt both relieving and terrifying. She listened without judgment, then asked a question that cut through my rationalizations. She asked whether I still felt safe making those decisions. I didn't answer right away. Safety in this context wasn't about physical risk. It was about moral clarity, about being able to stand by a decision without replaying it endlessly. When I finally responded, my voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. I said I wasn't sure anymore. The realization settled heavily. Medicine teaches resilience, but it doesn't teach you what to do when resilience turns into endurance without relief. Continuing simply because you always have is not the same as continuing because you should. I drafted a formal request to transition out of inpatient hospice work, asking to move into a clinic-based role within the same system. The language was professional, measured, deliberately vague. I didn't mention specific cases. I didn't accuse the system of anything. I framed it as a matter of fit. The response came a week later. The position I requested wasn't available. Staffing needs required my continued presence in the inpatient unit. The message was polite, apologetic, final. I read the email twice, then closed my laptop and sat there longer than necessary. This was the moment when avoidance was no longer an option. Either I stayed and accepted the discomfort as part of the job, or I acknowledged that something fundamental had shifted. That night back on the unit, I watched a nurse adjust a patient's blanket, her movements practiced and calm. I felt a pang of envy. She could do her work without carrying the burden I was carrying. Not because she cared less, but because her role didn't require her to draw the line I was now questioning. I realized then that my struggle wasn't a failure of competence. It was a conflict between the kind of physician I had become and the kind of decisions inpatient hospice demanded. That conflict wasn't going to resolve itself with time or experience. If anything, it was deepening. I wrote my resignation the next morning, not dramatically, not in anger, just a straightforward letter stating my intention to leave my role at Cedar Haven. I thanked them for the opportunity, for the years of trust, for the work we had done together. I did not explain beyond that. When I handed the letter to my supervisor, she looked surprised, then concerned. She asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I considered the question carefully before answering. I told her no, not because the work wasn't important, but because I was no longer the right person to do it. Walking out of the building later that day, I felt an unexpected sense of lightness mixed with grief. I wasn't leaving medicine. I wasn't abandoning patients. I was stepping away from a role that required a kind of certainty I could no longer honestly claim. The decision didn't bring closure. It didn't resolve the questions that had followed me since Kara's case, but it did bring alignment. For the first time in months, my actions matched what I knew internally to be true. As I drove away from Cedar Haven, the building receding in the rearview mirror, I noticed how ordinary it looked in daylight. No sign of the nights it held, no hint of the moments that had reshaped my understanding of my work. I carried those with me, aware that leaving didn't mean escaping them, only acknowledging that they had changed me in ways I couldn't ignore. I noticed the difference on my first week in the clinic, standing in a hallway that smelled like printer toner and hand sanitizer instead of disinfectant and warm blankets. The pace was faster, the problems more defined, the outcomes easier to measure. Patients came in, were evaluated, treated, and sent on their way. It was medicine with edges again, and that should have been comforting. On my second day, I signed a death certificate for a patient who had passed overnight at home. It was routine, the kind of administrative task I had performed countless times before. I picked up the pen, reviewed the chart, confirmed the details, and paused, not because anything was unclear, but because my body hesitated in a way it never used to. The pause lasted only a second. Anyone watching would have missed it. I signed the document and handed it back, my expression neutral, my voice steady. But the hesitation stayed with me, a small echo of a night I could not unsee. Clinic work settled into a rhythm. I adjusted medications, explained diagnoses, reassured families. I smiled when appropriate. I made jokes when they helped. From the outside, I looked like a physician who had simply changed roles. From the inside, I was learning how to live with a different relationship to certainty. Kara's face did not haunt me in the way people expect. I did not see her in dreams or hear her voice in quiet rooms. What lingered instead was the memory of her hand closing around mine, the undeniable proof of presence in a moment the system had already labeled complete. I thought about that often, usually when I least expected it. When a patient squeezed my fingers during an exam, when someone's pulse felt weaker than anticipated, when a breath paused longer than the textbook suggested it should. Each time I reminded myself that awareness does not require panic. Noticing is not the same as intervening. Friends asked why I left hospice. I gave them answers that fit into normal conversation. Burnout, scheduling, a desire for change, all of those were true enough. None of them captured the full picture, and that was fine. Some experiences resist casual explanation. I kept in touch with a few colleagues from Cedar Haven. The unit continued as it always had. New staff came in, others moved on. Kara's case faded into institutional memory, referenced occasionally, but no longer fresh. The system absorbed it and moved forward. I wondered sometimes whether that was resilience or avoidance. Probably both. One afternoon, a nurse practitioner I worked with mentioned a patient who had shown brief responsiveness after being thought gone in another setting. She spoke about it lightly as an oddity. I listened closely, noting the way she chose her words, the places where she paused. I recognized the cadence immediately. I didn't correct her. I didn't offer an explanation. I simply nodded and said I had seen something similar once. The conversation moved on. Still, I felt a quiet solidarity in the exchange, an acknowledgement that these moments exist whether we build frameworks for them or not. Over time, I stopped trying to categorize what had happened to me as trauma or doubt or philosophical shift. Those labels felt too small. What had changed was my tolerance for pretending that medicine operates exclusively in clean transitions. I still believe in protocols, I still trust data, I still teach trainees to follow evidence and guidelines. None of that disappeared. What changed was my understanding of where those tools stopped being sufficient. I began incorporating that understanding into how I spoke with patients and families, not by undermining confidence, but by allowing space for uncertainty when it was honest to do so. I found that people responded well to that. They didn't want false reassurance. They wanted presence. Occasionally, I would drive past Cedar Haven on my way home, the building quiet in the early evening light. From the outside, it looked the same as it always had. There was no sign of the nights spent inside the decisions made, the moments that lingered beyond documentation. Buildings rarely reflect the weight they carry. I never returned to inpatient hospice work. That decision held. But hospice itself did not leave me. It reshaped how I practice, how I listen, how I decide when to slow down instead of pushing forward. When colleagues asked whether I missed it, I told them the truth. I missed the intimacy. I missed the way time stretched and mattered differently. I did not miss the moment of pronouncement, the instant when a human life is reduced to a line on a chart. That line used to feel solid to me, a boundary reinforced by training and repetition. Now it feels more like a threshold, something you cross with care rather than certainty. That awareness does not make medicine weaker. It makes it heavier and perhaps more honest. I still think about Kara Wynn not as a symbol or a lesson, but as a person whose dying did not follow a script. Her case did not reveal a flaw in the system dramatic enough to overhaul it. What it revealed was something quieter and harder to measure. There are moments in medicine when the questions outlast the answers, and no review committee can resolve them. Those moments do not announce themselves. They arrive disguised as routine tasks, ordinary shifts, familiar gestures. I continue to practice medicine with that knowledge in the background, not as a warning, but as a companion. It reminds me to listen longer, to observe more carefully, to respect the limits of what I can declare finished. The work goes on, patients come and go. Decisions are made every day that shape lives in ways we will never fully trace. I am still a doctor, still responsible, still committed. I simply no longer believe that the line between life and death always announces itself clearly. That belief has changed how I hold a pen, how I listen for breath, how I recognize the weight of a moment before I name it. It has not made my work easier, but it has made it more deliberate, grounded in the understanding that some boundaries in medicine are drawn by necessity rather than certainty, and that living with that truth is part of the responsibility we rarely talk about out loud. I've had time to sit with what that night taught me, and the lesson wasn't about mistakes or rare medical phenomena. It was about humility. Working in hospitals, we like to believe that experience eventually gives us certainty, that if you train long enough and see enough cases, the lines become clearer. What I learned is that some lines never do. Doctors and nurses are trained to act, to decide, to move things forward. But there are moments in medicine where the most honest response is to slow down and accept that not everything fits cleanly into our definitions. Those moments don't make headlines. They don't show up in textbooks. They live quietly inside the people who were there. This wasn't a horror story. It wasn't about fear. It was about realizing that caring for people at the end of life means carrying questions you may never fully answer. And that responsibility stays with you long after the chart is closed. If you've worked in a hospital, or if you're someone who listens to doctors and nurses' stories because you want to understand what really happens behind the doors, most people never see you already know this. Medicine is built on knowledge, but it's practiced by humans. If stories like this matter to you, if you want to hear more honest accounts from doctors and nurses about the moments that changed how they see their work, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. These aren't stories meant to scare anyone. They're meant to remind us how much weight real medical decisions carry and how rarely we talk about that openly. Thank you for staying with this one.